Everyone wants to be smarter, right? But has anyone ever told you there's a price to pay? A hidden cost? It turns out some of the world's most intelligent people, well, they aren't the happiest. And psychology actually has some pretty incredible answers as to why. So let's get into it and unpack the hidden side of genius. All right, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to look at 5 kind of surprising psychological hurdles that often come with a high IQ. We'll kick things off by busting the genius myth. Then we'll talk about that feeling of being alone in the crowd. What happens when you have a brain that just never sleeps? The weird paradox of feeling like a total imposter. And finally, we'll get into the curse of potential. Okay, first up, let's tackle the biggest misconception of them all, the genius myth. We all have this picture in our heads, right, of what a genius is supposed to be like. So the myth goes something like this. A high IQ is basically a golden ticket. You're set for a life of success, happiness, confidence, the whole shebang. But the reality? Well, the psychological data paints a very, very different picture. Research consistently shows that exceptional intelligence isn't just linked to achievement. It's also strongly correlated with a higher risk of anxiety, a really deep sense of social alienation, and this constant nagging self-doubt. So yeah, it's definitely not the simple superpower we all think it is. And that's the key, really. This whole conversation isn't about test scores or fancy job titles or big achievements. The real story is about their internal world, what's actually happening inside their heads every single day. It's a fundamentally different way of experiencing reality. And that different way of experiencing the world, it leads us right into our second point, this feeling of being alone in a crowd. And let's be super clear here. This isn't about being arrogant or thinking you're better than everyone else. It's about a very real, almost neurological barrier to connection. There's this really important insight from a group of researchers called the Columbus Group. Back in '91, they basically redefined giftedness. And what they said was, the very thing that makes a mind unique and gifted is also what can make that person incredibly vulnerable. Because when you perceive and process the world so differently, you need different kinds of support to thrive. And that's a need that, honestly, almost always goes completely unnoticed. So a huge reason for this vulnerability comes down to something researchers call the 30-point communication gap. It works like this. If your IQ is within about 15 points of someone else's, give or take, communication is usually pretty smooth and easy. But once that gap hits 30 points or more, things start to break down. And it's not about big words or vocabulary. It's about the ability to follow these really complex, abstract chains of logic. To one person, the other seems way too abstract, maybe even talking nonsense. And to the other, the first person seems simplistic. It's a total mutual misunderstanding. Okay, so what does that actually mean in the real world? Let's take someone with an IQ of 145. That's way up there, in the top 0.1%. For them, the people who are their true intellectual peers, the ones they can just click with effortlessly, well, that group makes up less than 2% of the entire population. Can you just imagine that? Going through your whole life and almost never meeting someone who operates on the same frequency as you? That's not just lonely, that's the very definition of intellectual isolation. And this feeling of isolation, it often gets even worse because of our third challenge, having a brain that literally never sleeps. A powerful mind is amazing for solving problems, right? But what happens when you can't turn it off? It becomes this restless, relentless engine that just keeps going and going and going. There's actually a psychological term for this, overexcitabilities. It's basically an inborn, super heightened ability to respond to, well, everything. And we're not just talking about feeling things more. It's a completely different quality of experience. It's like your brain's filter is set way, way lower than everyone else's, so more of the world just rushes in. And that can be amazing, but it can also be totally overwhelming. And these overexcitabilities pop up in 5 main areas. You've got the intellectual one. That's the person with the insatiable curiosity, always asking why. Then there's imaginational, living in this incredibly rich inner world of daydreams and vivid imagery. The emotional type is next, and they experience feelings with this just profound depth and intensity. You also have psychomotor overexcitability, which is that surplus of mental and physical energy. Think fidgeting, rapid speech, just a constant need to do something. And finally, there's the sensual type, who has a much more enhanced experience of sights, sounds, smells, and textures. Now, what happens when you combine that intense intellectual overexcitability with that deep emotional intensity? Well, you often land right here at something called existential depression. For highly intelligent people, thinking about the big questions, death, freedom, isolation, the meaning of it all, it's not just some philosophical chat you have late at night. It's a deep, personal, and often spontaneous confrontation with the fundamental anxieties of being alive. And that can turn it into a very real and very persistent form of depression. All of this internal turmoil, this constant thinking and feeling, it can lead to one of the most fascinating paradoxes in all of psychology. The smartest person in the room is very often the one who feels like the biggest fraud. But why? Why is that? Why do people who have all the evidence in the world of their own competence still feel like they just got lucky, like they're about to be found out? Well, the answer, it turns out, is deeply, deeply connected to perfectionism. Now, psychologists make a really important distinction here. There's adaptive perfectionism, which is the healthy kind. That's just setting high standards for yourself and enjoying the process of striving for them. But then there's maladaptive perfectionism, and that is a total trap. It's defined by this constant, paralyzing fear that you won't meet these impossibly high standards. Standards you often feel like you didn't even set for yourself. So, how strong is this link to feeling like an imposter? Well, one massive meta-analysis found a correlation of 0.747 between this kind of maladaptive perfectionism and the imposter phenomenon. Now, to put that number in perspective for you, a correlation that high is wild. It's almost unheard of in psychology. It basically means that for a lot of people, they are two sides of the very same coin. And all of this kind of builds up to our final point, which is something often called the curse of potential, that crushing, suffocating weight of having to live up to the label of being the smart one. I mean, how many smart people have heard this their entire lives? You're so smart, it should be easy for you. People mean it as a compliment, but it is absolutely devastating. What it does is create this expectation that success should be effortless. So the second you have to actually struggle, the moment you have to put in real effort, you immediately feel like a complete failure. Like you're not just letting yourself down, you're letting everyone down, and proving you were never actually that smart in the first place. And this fear, it creates a really dangerous psychological trap. Think about it. If your entire identity is built on being the smart one, then failure isn't just a setback. It's an existential threat. It feels like a threat to your very sense of who you are. And that can lead straight to things like procrastination and self-sabotage. Because let's face it, it's psychologically way safer to fail because you didn't really try than it is to give it your absolute all and risk finding out you just weren't smart enough. So, look, if you've been listening to all this and found yourself just nodding along, if you relate to the loneliness, the overthinking, the self-doubt, the pressure, please don't see these things as flaws. Try to see them as what they might actually be, indicators of a mind that is uniquely and powerfully wired. It might just mean you're a whole lot smarter than you've ever given yourself credit for. And all of this leaves us with one last, really big question to think about. In a society that's obsessed with high achievement, are we completely ignoring the profound internal struggles that so often come with it? Is it possible that our narrow definition of success, one that's only focused on the final outcome, is actually failing our most brilliant, our most creative, and our most sensitive minds?